Hello.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. You hear me?
Okay. Yes. Amazing.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone, to our 12th niche conversation of season 2. I'm Jessica Deutz. I'm one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Bathsheba Demuth. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. I am an environmental historian. I teach at Brown University down in Rhode Island in the States. And most of my work looks at the far north in various places in Russia, and in the United States and Canada.
Yeah, awesome. So, in January, you gave the Melville Nels Hoffman Annual Lecture in Environmental History, which is a lecture that's hosted by York University. And it was called Reindeer at the End of the World, Apocalypse, Climate, and Soviet Dreams. And I thought we'd talk about it a little bit today, or some topics related to it. Firstly, I thought what came up to me when I was rewatching the presentation for this was the idea of experiencing a place. And last niche conversation with Tatagucho Sam, I had talked to him about visiting the Sundarbans in India and how that related to and really enriched his scholarship. So I wonder if we could start off by how do you feel experiencing a landscape enriches your scholarship and you as a human being?
That's such a great question. And I think it's one in environmental history that we often sort of implicitly take as important, but it's not necessarily made explicitly part of people's methods.
Yeah.
I find it extremely difficult to write about places that I don't have any physical connection with. And perhaps that's actually just a limitation of mine as a writer. I know that many people are able to travel to places through imagination. And obviously, we're always moving to the past that is not identical to the landscapes we're in the present.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I find that being able to have some relationship with a place that you're writing about lets me come to the historical sources with kind of a different set of perspectives. And knowing the ways in which people in the present live in those places and understand them, and understand the ways that they live there as being conditioned by history is really helpful to reading sources, and thinking about what's outside of the sources, what's left out, what's included, and often just things to emphasize that perhaps wouldn't be as obvious if you didn't know a place particularly well. I think things like, when you write about the North, of course, you know that the cold matters, the kind of seasonality, the ways in which the patterns of light and dark seem very different than in temperate areas. But if you live in a place and can understand that not as being abnormal, right, which is the tendency if you're coming from a temperate zone, but actually as, something that is habitual, I think that's like one example of a place where it can feel helpful in terms of how you approach the more traditional historical sources.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of like a empathy building with the past historical figures. And I was lucky enough to be able to visit all of my case studies when I was doing my dissertation. Not everyone is as lucky because of, funding options, where their case studies are, etc. I also, I've written about my homeland, like the park I grew up outside of. And I've actually found that even harder because I have such a close relationship to it that it's almost alienating to have to step back and put myself into the scholar and to be to analyze something that I know so intimately. So there's different aspects and interesting things, but I always enjoy learning about your experiences living in the North and how that shaped everything. So also a main theme in the talk is the concept of apocalypse, which has been on my mind. The first episode of season 2 of Niche Conversations, I spoke with Tilly Hinton, who hosts Storytime for the Apocalypse. So this question kind of came from her because she asks all of her storytellers to reflect on what apocalypse means to them and how it has changed through time. So I'm going to ask you today to talk about apocalypse and how your relationship to that concept has changed through time as you've grown up and learn different things, etc.
Yeah, so the talk that I gave at York that you mentioned at the beginning is really sits at the confluence of, I think, two ways in which apocalypse has kind of featured in my research. I don't know if I thought about the term very much growing up. I didn't grow up
Yeah.
in a particularly um, in a household where the kind of religious practice would focus on apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
But in graduate school, my graduate advisor, who I mentioned in the talk, was writing a book about the ways in which early Bolsheviks, kind of prior to the Russian Revolution and then during the Russian Revolution and right after, kind of had this apocalyptic sense of what it meant to transform the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that really kind of fueled their vision of what a revolution was and what political change was, and just the stakes of the project of kind of creating a communist state. And so I was kind of, that was just kind of an idea that was around. I was listening to my advisor as he was thinking through it. His name is Yuri Sluskin, and the book that came out of this is called The House of Government, which, if you want sort of a tour de force on kind of early Soviet history, it's marvelous. But it always struck me that understanding of apocalypse, which, whatever you want to say about the Soviet experiment, and obviously it is a way of organizing the government that has ended. It did not last into the 21st century, but it was firmly motivated out of a set of very utopian ideals, and the desire to make a world that was better for people, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a real kind of core of justice. Obviously, it goes awry in all sorts of ways in practice. But it's such a different way of thinking about kind of bringing about a new world than the ways in which apocalypse just kind of gets name checked in the public sphere now, right? Where it's almost always associated with the climate. It's associated with, the kind of scourging fire of the apocalypse, but not necessarily the kind of utopia that comes afterward. That's a really kind of bleak vision. And so this essay was in some ways, and the talk that came out of an essay that I wrote, was a way to try to think through how are those two things in parallel? Kind of what are the assumptions about the idea of apocalypse that happen when we name check it kind of casually, when we just talk about the latest IPCC report or some other piece of climate news that's quite discouraging. And what is it in the kind of Bolshevik tradition of apocalypse, of thinking about the need to remake the world, that might be helpful to think with, and what parts of it are not.
Mm-hmm. I loved your point in the talk about talking about apocalypse as escapism, as kind of throwing up your hands into a nihilist, like nothing matters, we're all doomed. And I always bristle at that. As a historian, I always think of everything's always been kind of awful. And like people have been moving through really hard times forever, right? And like a lot of us are kind of thinking of this world that was based on like this post World War II white middle class world. Like that's the world that is like in many ways like in danger right now, right? So a lot of us, it's like our personal, like we're not going to have that, but the people before that didn't have that either. Or being like, as a white scholar, when I'm kind of feeling giving into those apocalyptic messages that we're being bombarded with, just like being humbled by the fact that Black scholars, Indigenous scholars talking about how they've already experienced apocalypse, right? Their societies, their cultures have already gone through an apocalypse, and they came out the other side, and what that means, which kind of comes to the last question that I have today. And you talk about the Chukchi, their story, and how it's kind of a story of resilience, I would say. And I was wondering if you think this story that you tell in the talk about this resilience is a story of hope, and why or why not you would categorize it as such.
Yeah, that's a good question. I personally am not a huge fan of hope. I find that people often sort of, if you get to the end of and talk about environmental history or you've written something about it, people are like, well, where do you find hope? As if that's just something that's given to you. And I think that one of the things that the Chukchi experience of the kind of rise of the Soviet Union and then its collapse in the 1990s is that hope isn't actually the sustaining emotion in that experience, right? The thing that actually makes one resilient is far more active, and it's considerably less like the sense of when people ask what gives you hope, there's this like, well, I sort of should be guaranteed its existence, right? Like something out there should give it to me. And my sense from talking to people who've lived through events as truly kind of world shattering as like the fall of the Soviet Union is that you have to learn how to get by without that sensation, right? You don't know when it's going to end. You don't know if things are going to get better. And the task is, how do you keep your lives together and be good to each other in those circumstances? And I don't think that hope is exactly the emotion that is, right? I think it's something a little grittier and much more active, right? It's far more about kind of the creation of community and ways of living that can actually get you through the present without assuming that some force is going to come down and transform things for you. And maybe it's just because of how hope is, in English, we talk about hope being given. And I think that these situations of real kind of social and sometimes ecological rupture are places where you have to do a lot of making rather than expect something to be given.
Yeah, I love that. And the reason I asked this is that I feel like on Twitter and the environmental history hashtag, I see every month or more like someone asking, I want to give my students hope. How do I teach hope in environmental history classroom or et cetera? And so I think it's something that people are kind of grasping at. But I kind of err on the same side as you, as thinking that maybe hope isn't exactly the thing, or it's almost like a privileged emotion, like to have hope in these situations, like means that you are in a place where you're still able to like take yourself away from the day-to-day survival and think of like futures unknown. And also the danger of, as white scholars, like taking a hold of like a narrative like the Chukchi and making us like hope, where like the people who actually experienced it, like
that's not awful, what it was.
And some people didn't make it through, right?
And it was an experience to give us lessons in how to face the climate crisis, right? Like it's not so operationalizing other people's lives that way is also kind of gives me the crawlies.
Exactly. So that's interesting, but I do feel that it's an interesting conversation that comes up very frequently in environmental history circles. And it's just interesting to see different ways that people come down.
And I think there's a lot of space between the kind of nihilism that comes up in the kind of when you evoke apocalypse, right? When you're like, well, it's all over, it's out of our hands, and a kind of reflexive over optimism too. I think that there's a lot of emotional space and there's a lot of political space that sits between those two poles. It's not an either or choice.
Exactly. That was great. So there's a lot of detail, like we kind of like talked about bigger concepts than the actual like content of the talk today. So I suggest everyone check the talk out. It's about 40 minutes, I think.
I think so.
It's on YouTube at the Nature's Past channel and also on our website. And also check out Bathsheba's other writing, and you're always writing brilliant things. And just want to thank you for joining me today, and this was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye.